Check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. Check, 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 check. All right.
Boring.
And you know how this works.
I use it every time. Yep. The whole way on the whole way off. Yes.
Yep.
Yes. I know exactly. Can I ask you a favor? Can you fill that in the thingy bobbers in there too? Okay.
We need to wipe out.
Okay, I'll hold this up.
You have a white piece of paper? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
With the lights off.
Okay.
We're just testing. Keep talking. Keep talking. We're just testing the camera, so keep talking. That's why it's also really good that we do what I just did. All right, so we'll wait for Brad to say go. We've had really awesome success with people watching these films lately, which is kind of cool. So my sister and brother-in-law in Utah are watching this evening. They're public lands people. All right, so let me get the slide where we need it. All right, so welcome to the third of 10 Naturalist Nights. As many of you know, the Naturalist Nights program is a free speaker series that happens up and down the valley, up in Aspen and in Carbondale, that's hosted and put together by the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies, or ACES, the Roaring Fork Audubon Society, and the Wilderness Workshop. So it's an awesome partnership. And these happen here at 5:30 on Wednesday nights, and in Aspen at Hallam Lake at 7 o'clock on Thursday nights. And so, as I mentioned, you always can check these out online. They're being live streamed as we speak on our social media channels, and they are archived. And so if you ever are sick and can't come or just miss it or want to share what you saw because you thought it was so great, you can go find them and share them with your friends. And they're all on our websites. We have some organizational information here on the table. Feel free to help yourself. All of this happens because of amazing sponsors. Some of the sponsors on this slide are actually in this room tonight, and that's always say thank you to every one of you. And I always remind you to tell others that you know who, if you frequent these businesses, to tell them thank you. It takes a village to make this kind of stuff happen, and there's quite a village that supports this work. Some of our sponsors give a little bit more money than others, and so our featured sponsor tonight is Craig Ward's Aspen Snowmass Sotheby's International Realty. So big shout out of thanks to him. As I mentioned, these are filmed, but also they get aired on Grassroots TV throughout the year. So sometimes you might get surprised and see a Naturalist Night in July if you watch Grassroots. So thanks to Grassroots for sharing these broadly. There is a clipboard that I'll pass around in a few moments to have you put your name on, please. We don't share that information with anybody else. It just helps us with numbers, so thank you for doing that. And as I mentioned last week and previously, we do have continuing education credit hours available for anybody who's an educator that needs those hours, and there's a special clipboard on the table over there. Make sure you sign there. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, make sure you come back next week. A longtime local named Gary Zabel, who has been a professor at CMC for many years, will be speaking about geology next week, local geology, and his presentation is called Can Rocks Talk? Geology's Story from the Bottom of Glenwood Canyon to the Grottos. So that'll be one not to miss. So tonight's speaker, before I introduce tonight's speakers, there's a whole bunch of chairs up here in the front. So all of you who don't have chairs or can't see very well, come. There's a big empty spot. And also over here on my right. So it's a pleasure this evening to be able to introduce Dr. Melanie Armstrong. She's the Public Lands Coordinator in the Master of Environmental Management program at Western State University in Gunnison. She teaches courses in environmental policy, public lands, politics of nature, and environmental history. I've known Dr. Armstrong for the past few years as we both serve on the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education Board of Directors Executive Committee. We're both officers as of recent. Last year, her book, she's authored a couple pieces that are pretty cool. Last year, her book, Germ Wars, The Politics of Nature and America's Landscape of Fear, was published. It examines the politics enabled by the belief that nature, in this case microbes, can be managed through cultural practices. And you can find that book online. She's also co-authored a piece called Environmental Realism, Challenging Solutions, which argues for new approaches in the language and practice of environmental management. Dr. Armstrong's research interests include political ecology, governance and public lands, and science and technology studies. Tonight, her 15 years of experience with the Park Service will provide an informative lens as she explores the gulf between ideals of untouched nature and the reality of day-to-day administration of public lands, as embodied in modern management activities like permitting, entrance fees, and resource education. She was changing her presentation or adding to it by the hour this afternoon, so as you know, if those of you who've heard the news today. So I'll leave you wondering, and I'm so happy that Melanie can be here today.
That's there. All right, I'll give a moment to make sure all the mics are working. Everyone can hear me. Very good. Forgive me too, because I am recovering from a cold enhanced by a drive over several mountain passes this afternoon. I can hardly hear myself speak. So please let me know if I'm too loud, too quiet, whatever I can adjust to. And know that my slides are mostly backdrop here, hopefully to keep things a little more interesting. But I'm going to explore a lot of ideas with you today, and I hope you'll be patient and excited and eager to explore those with me. And I look forward to talking with you after and hearing some of your response and thoughts in reaction to that. So I'm coming to you today from a slightly new position for me. Academically, as you heard in my introduction, I'm an environmental historian and a political ecologist. So I look at the history of our cultural relationships with nature in order to understand something more about who we are today and what shapes our relationships in the present. So I look at geology and biology. As Sarah mentioned, I recently came out with a book about microbiology, in particular how our relationship with microbes has sort of shaped the world that we live in today. But I also look at the social systems in which we live our everyday lives as they shape the material environmental world around us. And so I like to play at that intersection between that which is cultural and that what is natural, and really push those together and pull them apart and see what happens in that conversation. On the other hand, I also spent 15 years working as a park ranger with the National Park Service. And in that career, I had a whole different perspective on what it means to be an environmental manager. So a few years ago, when the opportunity came up to combine these worlds that I worked in, working as an employee of a public lands agency and my academic background in environmental history and political ecology, I took it. So I ended up working at Western State Colorado University in our new Master in Environmental Management program. Those of you who were here 2 weeks ago may have heard Dr. John Hausdorfer speak on his work on wildness. He is the director of the program that I work under today. And I have this opportunity then to serve as a public lands coordinator, working with students to think through some of these challenging ideas about public lands. And my hope is that in that work, I can bring together those big questions along with some practical ideas and thoughts that these young folks who are going out to pursue careers in environmental management will take with them in order to be better prepared to address some real public lands management challenges that they'll be facing in the near future. For example, we have seen, this is what Sarah saw me adding to my presentation this morning, headlines. The top two from just hours ago, the bottom two from within the past couple days, thinking about what public lands mean to us as American citizens, what they mean in a global context today, what they mean as political tools and devices being used by one party or another. Public lands are very much in the public eye today, as they have been, I will argue, throughout a lot of history. But I have the opportunity then, I think, to bridge this world where I've worked in public lands into the contemporary moment and offer some thought and reflection. And that's what I hope to do today. I hope you'll be excited by the chance to maybe gain some background and some environmental history perspective that will give context to what we're seeing happen today, but also maybe some tools to think through what is going on in order to find more progressive ways forward. What options are available to us? What can we do as citizens in this new political climate to rethink public lands and find ways to assert an identity around public lands as we want it to be today? So I'm going to start this journey back when I was working as an interpreter, an interpretive park ranger at Canyonlands National Park. It's September 30th, 2013. I'm working in the Island in the Sky district of Canyonlands, and for about 3 days, there's been a lot of talk in the media about a potential government shutdown. There's a funding crisis at hand. Obamacare is being debated, about the funding of Obamacare is being debated in Congress, in both houses of Congress, and it seems more and more likely that there's not going to be a resolution between the two political parties and the president in order to get a budget on the table for the start of the new fiscal year on October 1st. Now here's the thing. It is actually illegal for an employee of the federal government to spend any time preparing to not work. You can't go to work on September 27th and say, okay, if a government shutdown is going to happen, what are we going to do? You can't do that. That's a misuse of taxpayer money. So we're still going to work, pretending like everything's fine, going up, talking to visitors who are coming in panicked about what's going to happen when the park shuts down. And all we can say is, we don't know. We're going to wait until we see what happens in Congress. We're holding out hope that things are going to come through and we're going to get our budget. About noon on September 30th, I received the first directive of how we were going to handle a government shutdown should it happen. So it's noon, I get off work at 5. I've got about 5 hours to figure out how to close a national park. I remember hearing a story in the news once about the restaurant chain Denny's, famous for being open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they made a decision one year to close for Thanksgiving or Christmas or some holiday. And there was like catastrophe ensued. Nobody knew where the keys to the buildings were. Like nobody had gone through the process of closing a Denny's restaurant before because they were always open. You never had to lock the doors. And I felt like that when I was trying to figure out how to close a national park, right? So you think, first of all, okay, I can lock the buildings. I can lock the building, I can put up signs. That's easy enough to do. We actually got directives from Washington, D.C. about what our signs were going to say, so I could figure that part out. But then I had to think about, okay, now I'm going to keep people from coming into the park, right? That might be the place to start anyway. So we need to put out some signs on the road and maybe close a gate. Guess what? The road to Canyonlands does not have a gate. So we made one. We went and got us some barricades and cement and kind of poured ourselves and some posts and put up a gate in front of our park. We didn't have one, so we went and out and improvised. So now you think about, okay, what do you do about the people who are already there? All right, so there's people who are camped in the campground. I've just put up a gate that's going to trap them in the park. Do I have to tell them to leave? Do I allow them to stay? Do I let them kind of leave voluntarily? Remember, I have no idea whether the government's going to be shut down for 12 hours or 12 days. So I'm thinking through this process, okay, well, maybe we go and tell them at least that the government has shut down and maybe that they should think about leaving, but I'm not gonna like force them out of the park. And then there's people who are on like multi-day river trips way in the backcountry. Are we gonna go hunt them down? Are we gonna ask them to leave? They can't go upstream. Do we let them finish their river trip as they continue on out of the park? All right, so we've got these people taken care of. We kind of came up with a plan. We allowed folks who were already in the campground to stay the night, and then most of our visitors were one-night visitors anyway, so they kind of trickled out. But then we have a virtual presence as well. This is the modern park. So there's plans being made about shutting down our internet, about closing the website, about stopping social media posts. We had pre-recorded messages that we had to record on all of our outgoing answering machines. And basically we were allowed to come into work for about 3 or 4 hours the morning after the government shut down to make sure that all of that was taken care of. Now, as government shutdown is again in the news and people are thinking about what that means, I'll spend just a moment talking about why government shutdowns happen and what that means for employees. The long and short of it is that the government, we operate on an anti-deficiency act. So the government's not allowed to spend money that it doesn't have. And if Congress doesn't appropriate money to the government, then those who spend money, basically employees who earn money that's an expense on the government, are no longer able to work and earn their wages. And so by going into work for a few hours on a government, when the government was shut down, I was already violating the Anti-Deficiency Act because there was no guarantee that I could be paid for the work that I was doing. So there was a lot of faith that went on, and a lot of, you may remember conversations about essential and non-essential personnel, which was quickly realized to be very bad language, very political language. If you want to start saying that your government is not essential, it's going to be hard to get that government funded because you just labeled that all of those employees aren't essential. So then they switched and started calling us accepted or unaccepted employees. So I was one of the unaccepted ones. I had a few hours to work and get my work done, and then basically I had to go back and sit in my residence. Now at the time, I lived inside the boundaries of Canyonlands National Park. So my house is now in a federally closed area. I had to go around that barricade. Where did my barricade go, right? I had to go around this barricade in order to get into my house when I wanted to go home at night. And there's all sorts of new stipulations that are being put upon us as residents. In Canyonlands, because we were a pretty small community, it was pretty informal, but some of the larger parks, for example, actually sent the people who lived in the park strict regulations about, say, walking your dog. If the general public is not allowed to recreate in a federal public land, you as an employee should not be allowed to recreate in a federal public land. And perhaps walking your dog, it counts as recreation. So there were strict regulations. You could only walk for a half mile. It had to be on one of the main park roads. You weren't allowed to go off on any other trails, all in defining what it meant to have this public lands space closed. That became important in this conversation about public lands. And then, of course, I was kept on call. For the length of the shutdown, I had to call in the morning. You could watch the news and figure out pretty much what was going on, but if you didn't have the news, there was a hotline where you could call in, and our deputy superintendent would record a message every morning saying, the shutdown has continued, you are not required to report to work today, please check again tomorrow, with the expectation that we would come back to work within about 12 hours of being notified that the government was resuming operations. Now, as a side note, as it happens, I was working in Utah, where the state actually ended up paying to open the Utah parks early. So we ended up sort of scrambling back to work even when the national news was still in lockdown over the shutdown. So a little different circumstances in Utah where I was working at the time. But all in all, basically the government sits on hold and we wait. We sat in our quiet housing area, which was normally very quiet, but somehow seemed even more quiet when the rest of the park was shut down. And you may remember some public controversy surrounding the events of the government shutdown as well. Remember the closing of the memorials on the National Mall. And they actually drew a great deal of attention when an honor flight from Mississippi came to visit the World War II memorial. And there was a confrontation when it appeared that those veterans who had flown to see the memorial would not be allowed to actually visit the memorial. As it turned out, there was a debate, or they were allowed to enter as an exercise of their First Amendment rights, but the general public was still prevented from entering that site. Pardon a little bit of hand gesture in the next image, but there were weddings that were canceled, caused a lot of upset. People whose plans were foiled by not being able to hold their wedding where they wanted it to be. That got a lot of media attention. And we also saw a number of acts of civil disobedience, where people chose to express their First Amendment rights by climbing over barricades at Zion National Park and other places in order to force entry onto their public lands. And the conversation about loss of tourism revenue also became very hot in the public debate. This is what led to the opening of the Utah parks early, and some other parks, Grand Canyon, I believe, and others, were about access to tourist revenue. The government was shut down for 17 days during October, which is the height of the backcountry travel season in Moab and southern Utah, in those parks where I was working. And so loss of revenue became a big concern, that people would, rather than going to the Grand Canyon, they would go to Las Vegas or other places where they could access their activities. So in the midst of all of this media hubbub, all of the people climbing over and protesting and trying to access their public lands, one image in all of this really caught my attention. You can imagine I had a lot of time sitting at home watching the news, so I was paying attention to this. And this image is the one that has stuck with me for years since the shutdown. And as I've transitioned into my academic role, is one that I find myself coming back to and rethinking with my students, and wanting to understand what feelings are being expressed in this image, what it is about our identity as Americans, about our relationship with our public lands, that comes out in these words. So this image is at Olympic National Park, and it was published in a newspaper there. And essentially the same thing as we saw at Canyonlands, right? Like here are the little signs saying the government, the national park is closed following the standard letterhead. And then someone has come along and scrawled on the temporary barricade put in place there at Olympic the words, "Nature should be free." Nature should be free. What does that mean? What was this person who was responding in some way to this really heated political moment? What was he or she trying to express in that phrase, nature should be free? What type of free? Are we talking about economic free, like it shouldn't cost anything? Or are we talking about free as in it should be open to everyone? Or free as it should not be contained or bound in? What assumptions do we carry about nature and freedom? Why do we presume that public lands should be free? And what do we mean when we use the term free alongside words like nature and public lands? I also want to understand the assumptions about space and place that underlie this thinking. And of course, there is the contradiction inherent in this statement. Imagine me sitting here, deemed non-essential, sitting there in my house in a closed national park, wondering when I'm going to go back to work, whether I will have income this month, wanting to do my work, knowing that that work comes at a price to the federal taxpayer, contemplating a statement like this, that nature should be free. Arguments around closing parks centered on protecting people and places. And I think the evidence that came out through the government shutdown, and one that I find myself coming back to again and again, is an understanding of how managed our public lands really are, because we see when the management stops, we see what happens. And so people argued that the parks needed to be open, or that we had to close the parks during the shutdown because of the infrastructure. We had, there are people out there whose work involves protecting public lands and keeping these lands safe and open to the public. We have toilets, we have people who move the waste out, we have roads, we have water, we have buildings. And so this was a primary argument when organizations like San Juan County in Utah actually argued, well, we should be able to come in and open Canyonlands. We can run it with our local staff just as well as the federal staff can, so it should be open to the public. And the Park Service countered with, you don't have the ability to provide that same level of waste management, to maintain the infrastructure, to protect the places, the water, and the buildings. Protection also ties into this, right? The idea that someone could come in, and I was thinking today as I drove past Blue Mesa Reservoir, right? That if you stopped protecting that space and stopped doing aquatic invertebrate inspections on boats that were being launched into Blue Mesa, one boat could introduce invasive species into the reservoir that might never be contained. And so what does it mean to be vigilant at all moments, even when the government is shut down? Is that cause to close access to public lands in order to keep that one person from launching a boat without an inspection that introduces an invasive species that threatens both the ecosystem of the area and the hydroelectric power production, right? So you start getting into these debates about protecting the space as well. So it's in part about infrastructure. It's in part about permits, right? It's about deciding who can be there and when, right? So I didn't have to deal with this in the national park where I was working, but I have colleagues who worked, for example, for the Bureau of Land Management. They had to make decisions during the government shutdown about grazing. Do you allow ranchers to continue to graze cattle on federal property when the government is shut down? If I'm not allowing someone to recreate in Canyonlands, should a rancher whose livelihood depends upon ranching be allowed to graze cattle on public lands? What about someone who has leased public lands for mineral exploration, right? So you can see this layering of thought that goes into some really concrete decisions and actions around shutting down a federal government operation. A couple other things that you may not think about might be science, right? There was some controversy around the government shutdown and ongoing science experiments in laboratories, right? The CDC, were they allowed to come in? Was it deemed essential work to go in and continue feeding mice that were part of a multi-year experiment on a health issue, right? Is that deemed to be essential work or not? Those types of debates kind of raged around this time period. And even in places like Canyonlands, thinking about just, research that was being done in the park, we think about public lands so often in terms of recreation or in terms of mineral exploration. But what about science? What about the science that happens in public lands, and to what extent does protecting the ability for scientific work to continue in public lands become essential even during a government shutdown? And then, of course, this is about political designation, right? This land has been defined around certain uses. So we designate wilderness areas as being able to be used in particular ways. We designate backcountry areas as being able to be used in particular ways. So the arguments around closing the public lands centered around being able to enforce designated uses. And so part of the role then of these management agencies becomes not just ensuring that people have access to public lands, but that they access it in the prescribed way. And that way, it's our policies and our regulations that have also shaped our public lands and allowed them to actually become defined in a way that can be enforced. So see, that's kind of circular logic there, right? In order to define the public lands in particular ways, that's a policy act, and then you bring in agencies that enforce those policies that reaffirm that the public lands continue to exist the way that they have. And so this becomes this complex world full of different types of permits and policies and infrastructure and science work going on. This becomes the form of nature that we're fighting for here. When that person scrawled across the words, "nature should be free," I keep wondering, was he or she thinking about nature in terms of this national park landscape that's so complex and layered with meanings and different ideas, or simply about trees and bison and wolves and all of those kind of fun nature symbols, right? This, I would argue, though, is the form of nature that we are fighting for. It's the only form of nature we know, and it's managed, and it's a particularly prescribed form of nature. And the shutdown, I think, exposed to us in 2013 in a new way exactly how managed our public lands are. And so I want to explore with you for a moment now a little bit of the history that I've looked at as I tried to understand this issue. And then I'm going to go back and put it in the context of this word free and its kind of two meanings around freedom and value. So as a historian, I went and grabbed my historical toolbox and began studying the different ways that people had thought about nature and freedom and the environmental management state. And I learned a lot from other historians along the way, but I also started at a place that I came from in my own life and my own experience in public lands. I worked for many years in Yellowstone National Park, where we tell often a very famous story. And the story has to do with one of the early expeditions to Yellowstone. And they're traveling, it's the 1870s, they're traveling around Yellowstone, really amazed by what they'd been seeing in this place. You see geysers shooting out of the ground, sort of geologic marvels, this crazy new landscape. And the story goes that they were kind of concluding their expedition in a place where two rivers come together and form the Madison River, which heads out of what is now Yellowstone National Park. And the story is that they were sitting at the base of a tall mountain at the fork of these two rivers, gathered around a campfire, reflecting and marveling on the experience that they had had in this really beautiful, spectacular landscape. And as they sat there around the fire, the story goes, they actually pondered aloud to each other about this place and what it could be. And they thought, wouldn't it be great if we could protect this place and turn it into a park, a place that everyone could come and enjoy and experience what we have experienced here. And so this great story says that they decided and vowed around that campfire that they would do just that they would go back home to wherever they were from, that they would take up the cause of protecting public lands, and they would create a national park. And then they went and they did, and we have Yellowstone National Park as a consequence of that singular campfire experience, the conversation and commitment of a few men gathered together to protect our public lands. And this is one of the origin stories of Yellowstone National Park. And there's now a national park mountain named just above that confluence of those rivers and the headwaters of the Madison. For many years, there was an exhibit at the ranger station nearby that told the story of these explorers gathered together making a decision to protect public lands. Yellowstone historian Lee Whittlesey has done a lot of research on this and has actually shown that that campfire conversation most likely never took place, and that people came in decades later, 30 or 40 years later, and started telling this story as if it had happened that way. That the agency came in and put up exhibits that told this mythical story at the base of National Park Mountain in order to perpetuate this idea, which I think is an interesting question because it begs the question of why it's so important to us that we have a story like that as the origin story of our public lands. Yellowstone is a spectacular place worthy of protection. I love to tell people that when Yellowstone was created as a national park, if you go look at the originating legislation, it says that hereby the land of the headwaters of the Yellowstone will be preserved and set aside as a public park and pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It is called the National Park Act, as if there would only ever be one national park. It is not called the Yellowstone National Park Act. It is called the National Park Act. And it was used to create what people thought would be the first, but actually proved to be a wave of national parks, of which we have more than 400 units of the national park system today. But that movement that began was probably as political as anything, probably not originated around some well-meaning ideal, but still valuable and still an important lesson for us to think about as we look at our history. So we cling to this myth of Yellowstone as part of our identity, but we have a history that tells a fundamentally different story. One of my favorite environmental historians wrote about the U.S. environmental management state. This man's name is Adam Rome, and he argues that the history of the United States has been almost entirely a history of environmental management. That if the United States did not have this vast expanse of land to manage, our government would look different than it does today. That's an idea that I want to chew on, I want to play on, because I think it really gets at something. I also love this quote from Randall Wilson's book, America's Public Lands. And he asked this, which I think is a very provocative question. Just how is it that a country more committed to commercial enterprise than any other in the world, and in which private property stands as one of the most cherished national values, chose to set aside almost 1/3 of its land as federally managed public lands? Isn't that a great question? We are a commercial society. We are committed to making money in our society, and yet we have this public lands ethic as well. And that seems like such a contradiction, and maybe even more so in our current political climate. It seems like such a contradiction. But maybe there's something in our history that can help us to understand that. And Wilson breaks it down into 3 phases that I think are quite compelling. He talks about a time when we were focused as a nation on building the commons. He argues that we've always been a land with the commons, that it wasn't just Yellowstone that first started the idea of a commons. And then we moved into a phase where we actually worked really hard to get rid of that commons, and then gradually shifted into more of a permanent retention. So playing a little bit more on what he actually showed. So here you can see a map of major acquisitions of territory, the Louisiana Purchase, Texas, Mexican, Oregon, all came about as ways to build and expand upon the colonies through purchase in some cases, through war in many cases. And through this whole process, the federal government spent years buying and gaining land. So the federal government became really committed to building land and possessing land and growing the country through the acquisition of land. And in so doing, there had to be some very particular ideas about what that land was like. The land had to be pristine. It had to be untouched. We had to ignore the current occupants of that land in order to feel good about acquisitioning it into our territories. So we went through this phase of building the commons. And so for a long time, the US had mostly land. It was a poor country with a lot of land. And so when we needed money, whether it was money to go to war, money to create states, money to build our Federal Reserve, the easiest way for us to do that as a nation, as a federal government, was to sell off land. And so once that commons was built, the federal government shifted into a nature as commodity thinking and began selling off that land. And it didn't matter that it went for pretty cheap in those days, because it provided a steady stream of income to the federal coffers at a time when the government had nothing else to generate revenue. And so we went into this period of disposing of the commons into private property. And we saw this in acts, the series of Homestead Acts, other acts encouraging westward migration and settlement. This served a couple other purposes as well. It served to establish states, right? Part of growing the nation was about disposing of the commons to the states, not so much in terms of giving the land to the states, which is a fallacy, which I would love to talk about at length, but I won't for now. The land was never given to the states except for those small parcels that were given as part of the school trust lands, which were given to states and states still possess. But the land was given to settlers, and it was sold to settlers at a way that would generate revenue for the federal treasury and would put people out there to form cities, to form communities, to become states. And so all of this work was using the commons to actually grow the nation. And that was very deliberate. Pardon me. So a couple of fallacies that come into play here, right? And I think that there's something important about our identity as Americans also emerging here. Thomas Jefferson was really about equality. He really loved the idea that every man, let's say man, every man could go out and own some land, start a farm, and sort of contribute to the nation. We might call this the Agrarian Ideal, right? Jefferson wanted people to be able to get a start for themselves through the ownership and possession of land. Private property, it turns out, was really convenient in setting up a democracy. If you're coming from a situation where a king or a monarch or some other authority owns and controls the land, and you only get to work on the land at the bequest or the will of that authority, owning land becomes something pretty special. And if you're starting a new nation and you don't want that king or the monarch or whomever to have a lot of authority, you don't want one person to rule everything, it makes sense that the best way to distribute power among people, to create a democratic government, is actually to distribute land among people. Land equals power, and therefore distributing land widely allows us to distribute power widely. And so this was one of those key ideas clung to by our founding fathers, particularly Thomas Jefferson and those who held with his camp of ideas. But then beyond that, as time goes on and that connection to private property perhaps should yield a little bit. I think that we cling to that still as such a strong identity as who we are as Americans. And in that we assume that private property rights supersede the rights of the government to manage land. Think about countries where most of the land is owned in private, right? How do you manage for ecosystems in those in countries like that? the government has to exert some authority over protecting rights above private property rights. So why is it that we bind ourselves within this country to the idea that private property rights supersede the rights of all citizens to health, to clean air, to clean water, to recreational values, to access to nature? There are plenty of other models in this country and beyond that show that a government could still say, you as a private property owner have to follow these regulations, that you as a private property owner have to respect these things in order to look out for the good of all citizens, which is what governments set out to do. And so this idea that the private property and the dispersal of the commons is the only way forward for this nation, I think binds us. It limits our ability to think about what we actually want the government to be. So was there the fear that the only way to keep sort of wild, untouched nature wild is through public ownership, I think limits us. I think that if we could find ways to think about that in terms of private ownership, it maybe takes a little bit of the pressure off of our public lands as being the only place where we can protect these values that we come to adhere to as citizens. So that's a little diversion. I'm going to come back here to this commons that we've now brought together. We've disposed of it as much as we could, and basically you're left with kind of the dredges, right? People like Yellowstone now, but back in the day, Yellowstone's about 9,000 feet above sea level. It's under snow for 9 months out of the year, and there's these crazy hot springs that come out of the ground through really acidic soil. It's really only good for growing lodgepole pine trees. Nobody wants to set up camp there. So why not make it a public park and pleasuring ground? No one else is doing anything else with it, right? And so you see this sort of the leftovers of the commons that are left behind and left to be done with whatever the government wants to do. And so you see in the history of the Homestead Act, right, as it moves further west, suddenly instead of giving people small parcels of land, they're giving them bigger and bigger parcels of land because really there's not much you can do to ranch or farm or maintain a landscape that's in these smaller parcels in Arizona. And so eventually the government is just left with the land they couldn't get rid of. And that becomes the commons that we know of today and think about as public lands. But it's already a problematic landscape because it's been cut up and divided and the good parts have been taken away and the stuff that people think they can make money off of has already been taken away. And you're left with kind of an unwanted landscape that's divided up in chunks. You can't really manage it well for ecosystems because it's not well connected. You can't manage it well for making money because all of those money-making parts have already been taken. And so the government's left in kind of a bind. It's supposed to make money off of its commons. That's what it's always served the purpose for. And yet now it's left with land that it's not successful in making money off of. And so Wilson argues that this is what we're left with today. We're left in this new period where the federal government's trying to figure out its role as a land manager of this commons that it really doesn't know what to do with. So we're going to back this up around now then and look at what this means in this question about managing public lands and nature should be free. And remember, just one more glimmer to take away from this then is this idea of commodity thinking, right? In order to get people out there on the land and settle it and farm it and produce out of it, we transformed nature from pristine, wild nature into nature as commodity, nature that's something that had value that could be bought and sold, traded on the marketplace. And this is a very different way of thinking about public lands and bringing into this conversation about what nature should and should not be. All right, so nature should be free. So let's start with entrance fees. This is nature should be free $, right? What do you get for your entrance fee when you come into a national park? So of our national park units, I'm going to use rough numbers here because they change pretty regularly. We have about 400 units, about 120 of them actually collect entrance fees. So when you pay an entrance fee coming into Canyonlands National Park, 60% of the money that you pay to get into the park stays in Canyonlands National Park. The other 40% goes back to a federal reserve, like for all the national parks, and gets redistributed to those parks that don't collect entrance fees, right? So if you go to the National Mall, for example, there's no entrance fee to go see the Lincoln Memorial. All of those sites have no entrance fee, and so they get some of the money that Canyonlands collects as an entrance fee goes back to them. So you come in, you pay your entrance fee, what does that money go to? Most of the money that is collected in park entrance fees goes to pay the salaries of the people who collect your park entrance fee. Most of it does. A little bit goes to the newspaper that you get when you come in. A little bit goes to a few other special projects that can be requested. And so occasionally you'll be wandering through a park and you'll see an outhouse and there's a sign on it that says paid for by your fee dollars. So that is where a little bit of it goes to. But by and large, most of the money to collect that goes into, or the most of the money that you pay when you go into a park pays the salary of the person who's collecting your money as you come into the park. So it's a job creator, right? We should be happy we're creating jobs. But I think there's a fallacy that exists that park entrance fees somehow generate revenue for the running of parks or other federal lands. In reality, they don't. Most of the money to operate all public lands comes from a congressional appropriation, hence why when we shut down in 2013, we couldn't operate because we didn't have money even from our own entrance fees. So in the controversy that you see these days around increasing entrance fees, the argument is that if we could increase the entrance fees, we could begin to address this fabled backlog of maintenance needs that exist within our public lands. But I think before we get into that conversation, we have to consider what we want our entrance fees to pay for. Do we want nature to be free, as in I should be able to visit the Grand Canyon and not have to pay for it? Is that a value that we hold as Americans? In 1996, we passed a piece of legislation called the Recreation Fee Demonstration Program that said no. That said we want those who actually go to visit the Grand Canyon to pay more than those who don't go to visit the Grand Canyon. And so that's when we first started including entrance fees into our parks in a way that would allow some of that money to stay in the park, some of it to go back, and actually began to manage federal entrance fees on that kind of level where you were dealing with congressional designation of what parks should or should not pay. So then you can raise the question of, should users of public lands pay the actual cost of running our public lands infrastructure? Now bear in mind that it doesn't begin to equate. What we currently pay would not begin to cover the cost of operating our public lands, and that there are all sorts of Forest Service areas out there and BLM areas and Fish and Wildlife areas that don't collect entrance fees at all, that are paid for almost entirely out of congressional appropriation. I have a family member who works for the Bureau of Land Management who likes to remind me that BLM is the only federal agency that actually gives more money back to the government than it receives, and that is through its leasing of oil and gas and other minerals. And so most land management agencies are running at a cost to the US taxpayer. They're not making the money through their entrance fees. So if we charge an entrance fee, if we increase it to the users, what values does that tick on for you? What values come into play, right? Should Yellowstone National Park exist whether I go there or not? Should it be protected for its scenic values, for its wildness values, for its scientific values, for its historic values? Should it exist whether I go there or not is a question that comes down to money. Should we be paying as a nation to fund those national parks whether we go there or not? Or should the bulk of that cost fall upon those who actually visit the parks? Should a national park be free? Can public lands be unmanaged with no protection, right? That would be another option. We could not charge an entrance fee and we could not provide services, right? When Yellowstone was created in 1872, they sat down and they drew a square line on a map and said, here's the park. And they asked so-and-so over there, would you volunteer to be the superintendent? And they brought in a volunteer superintendent and had lines on a map for many years before it became popular enough that they actually literally sent in the US Cavalry to protect the park, because there were no park rangers, there was no one else around to protect it. There were no laws saying what you could and couldn't do in the park. And so gradually the military came in, and then the Park Service was created in the 1916, and there became more funding for parks. But it was a gradual process that we began to realize that if we wanted to protect these places, there had to be money behind it. But maybe it doesn't need to be. Could lines on a map exist without protection? So that's nature should be free with our entrance fees. What about nature should be free with permitting and access? Part of the logic behind the proposed $70 fee increase in 17 of our major national parks is to limit use. The idea being that they're going to charge $70 per vehicle, which when I left Canyonlands, it was $10 per vehicle. They recently raised it to $20 per vehicle. So this would be more than it would be $50 more than the current entrance fee to Canyonlands if this legislation goes through, or if this policy goes through. And if this policy is approved, for 6 months out of the year, the entrance to Canyonlands would be $70. And so the idea being that that's going to, through market forces, drive people away from Canyonlands during the busiest time of the year. They'll choose to visit in the off season when it's not as busy, or maybe they won't visit at all, right? So part of the argument behind those fee increases centers upon distributing visitation to avoid crowding in national parks. But I would argue, and this was something that I debated in many ways during my tenure with the Park Service, when we say nature should be free, do we actually mean that nature should be open and available to everyone? What does it mean when we have a $70 entrance fee to kind of an obscure little park outside of Moab? Let's be honest here. So what does that mean about access? What does that mean about the cost of visiting our public lands, of recreating on our public lands, and about valuing certain public lands above others, right? It's easy to say, well, you don't have to go to Canyonlands, you can go recreate somewhere else. Go visit your national forest. But think about what that statement says about the value of Canyonlands versus those cheap and free public lands outside in your backyard, right? So think about what the value actually ascribes to these places. But part of the idea then is to push, if you can push it on a money scale, then you don't have to do it in a permitting scale. So there's also talk in many of our national parks about limiting access, about cutting the number of people that can go into a park on any given day. I was visiting Zion National Park over the holiday break, and they actually closed Zion Canyon about 10 o'clock in the morning and said, the canyon's full, we don't have any more room for visitors in there. It'll reopen about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock this afternoon when the crowds thin out. Check back in a few hours, basically. They closed access to the main scenic drive in Zion because it was too crowded, because there wasn't room for people to park and enjoy the place. What does that mean when it comes to visitor experience? That's the debate that we always struggled with. Visitors want to go to a park and experience it in its pristine, quiet solitude, all of those wonderful forms, but if it's crowded, maybe they're not having that positive experience, and we could limit that. We could limit the number of people that come into it. So if free means that anyone can access it, when we impose permits on things, how does a permit change our way of thinking about public access? There are all sorts of barriers to getting permits and such as well. Plus, this is about commodity thinking still. Does limiting the numbers increase the value of a commodity, like a limited edition print, right? If fewer people are allowed to access it, does it become more valuable? What knowledge and resources does it take to access a system that is permitted? You have to have access to a computer, you have to plan ahead, you have to have certain timeliness. Some of my students in the MEM program are here tonight, and they're working on permitting processes that are going into place in your backyard in the White River National Forest, thinking about access through permitting. It's an important time in our public lands because this has something to do with our values. This is shaping the way that we value these places. Permitting has a long history in our public lands. I'm going to touch on, it's like poking a fire because we don't have time to go all the way into it. But I'm going to touch on a longer history of permitting that has to do with permitting for grazing, right? This caused a certain amount of controversy not too long ago about people's permits and the rights to use public lands for their own profit, right? So permitting, that legacy of permitting that has long been in place for grazing, for timber harvest, is moving into recreation. And I think it bears pause to think about what that means and the implications are down the road. All right, so here we are. Grand Canyon's closed. Government shut down. We wait 17 days. We open. We come back with all sorts of thoughts about whether nature should be free. I want to end with another provocation from a year ago now, thinking about the role of government in managing places and what we value in our government employees. Just about a year ago, we inaugurated a new president. The National Park Service, who manages the National Mall, took a photograph of the inauguration, posted it on their Twitter feed, and compared the size of the crowd of the Trump inauguration to the Obama inauguration 4 years earlier. You may recall that led to some dismay among the administration, along with a couple posts about climate change coming out of another park, led to a gag order being placed upon social media of the National Park Service, basically restricting their ability to engage in this political discourse. In response, we saw the rise of the alt-NPS movement, an alternative Facebook site being created, posting ideas about censorship, about what government employees should and should not be able to say or do, and sort of the rise of this movement around an alternative identity for a civil servant. So I want to explore this for just a moment. As a rule, liberal governments tend to support bureaucracies. But maybe there's this overreaching judgment that bureaucracies are bad. Nobody really likes bureaucrats. There's a theorist, Hannah Arendt, who said that you need not be a murderer to carry out genocide, and that's due to bureaucracies. They seem to be the opposite of individuality. They seem to work against our kind of liberal ideas of who we are as a society. So why is it that in this moment that our liberal thinkers seem to love the idea of the rogue civil servant, kind of going against the man, right? In this case, quite literally. And I think there are many reasons for this. I think that bureaucracy serves a certain role in our society. It helps to assure us of a certain amount of impartiality of the actors, the organizations who govern kind of the messy complexity of our world. And there are so many actors in our policymaking who are necessarily biased, who are necessarily political and interested in certain ways, while the civil servant can kind of plead neutrality. They're the habitually disinterested actor. And I would argue that in some ways the Trump turn that we've seen recently is not just about the rejection of fact-based knowledge, but also the rejection of rational forms of governance that characterize the modern age. And so this moment when the civil servant rises up, it's not just about speaking truth, but it's about asserting a certain form of governance, about asserting the role of the bureaucracy as producers and managers of objective knowledge. We are in desperate search of bureaucratic order in a moment of chaos, and bureaucracies are in charge of sustaining the world as we know it. So I would argue that this moment that we saw a year ago was in part about the love of the park ranger, which is awesome. I love park rangers. But it's also about assuring ourselves that we have democratic order, that there are people out there like the park ranger who are looking out for normalcy, that are looking out for stability, that are looking out and regulating truth and knowledge and all of those things. I want to conclude with a sentiment expressed by Alan Spears, who is the Director of Cultural Resources for the National Parks Conservation Association. He wrote a column arguing against a famous statement that you've probably heard by Wallace Stegner, who referred to national parks as America's best idea. And he wrote this column and he said, "I think it would be fair to say that America's national parks mean a great deal to me, but parks are not America's best idea. And describing them as such may be preventing us from creating and sustaining the diverse constituency our national parks need to survive and thrive in their second century. As an African American, I will tell you that national parks don't crack the top 10 list of best ideas. The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, respectively, all occupy a higher place in the order of best ideas than our national parks. I think our national parks are like most of the other laudable, lofty ideals created by Americans, an ever-evolving concept filled with a great promise and in need of constant stewardship. If our job as citizens is to help create a more perfect union, then it makes sense that we should all have a role in creating a more perfect national park system." I think that's an important thing to consider. I think it's important to recognize national parks not just as a great idea that we once had and pat ourselves on the back, but as part of this evolving conversation about democracy, about who we are as Americans and who we want to be, what our ideals are. And they give us this great opportunity to exercise those ideas and to put them into play, especially when it comes to environmental challenges and issues that we face every day. Pardon me. Earlier this week, we celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and we see images like this of Martin Luther King standing and sharing his ideas with the world. And we chose at this time, we spend a lot of our time thinking about Martin Luther King and what he did to bring about rights for us as people, as individuals. But when we look at this picture, how much time do we spend thinking about the place where this took place? Martin Luther King's talk happened on public lands. It happened on a place where Americans had the ability to gather together in a public space and exercise their ideas of democracy and citizenship. And that same thing that happens on the National Mall could happen in any of our public lands. That when we act on these public lands, we act collectively as citizens and make decisions about what we want for our shared future. After the government shutdown, I was called back to work. I was told that nature was no longer free, that I had to get back to work managing it and do my work as a civil servant, as a bureaucrat, as an arbiter of knowledge and government. For nature is neither free nor free, but still central to who we are as Americans, as humans, and as residents of this planet. Thank you.
So we can have some questions and dialogue here. I'll pass around this microphone so that we can record your questions for Grassroots TV. So if anybody wants to be brave, that was an awesome presentation.
Hi. Talk real loud so everybody can hear you. You bet. Some say our wilderness is better protected when it is private land with a conservation easement. Considering who's running the Department of Interior, the EPA, and the BLM, what is your position?
Remember, my boss was here 2 weeks ago talking about wilderness, right? No, I think it's a great question, and I think it comes back to this idea about government and what we expect government to be. I think that government has the potential to protect land no matter whose hands it's in, but we don't allow it to do that. We're so hung up with, as a society, on the idea that government manages public land, people manage their own private land, and that we need to cultivate stewardship in private landowners and hopefully in the government as well. And I think what we really need are stronger legislative practices that we as citizens can bring about, whether it's through lobbying groups, whether it's through voting, whether it's through whatever work we do, however we engage in the political process. And mind you, I am recognizing the ideal here. But I think that we have the potential to create legislative practices, to create policies that protect our landscapes no matter whose hands they are in, whether they're in public land or in private hands, because we need to let go of this idea that just because I own land, I can do whatever I want to on it, my neighbor be damned, right? Like, we need to recognize private stewardship as a social responsibility, not just as a pleasant thing to do when it's convenient, right? And so I think, and this is sort of coming from my policy background as well, I think we fall short. We don't recognize the potential that policy could have to actually protect land no matter whose hands it is in. And I think that private land organizations do a tremendous job in protecting organizations through systems like land conservation systems. And I think that could be realized more along with protection of public lands. I give you lots of provocative ideas. Come on.
So I'm curious, what percentage of the total operation of the national parks do the permits and the entrance fees generate? In other words, how much
numbers?
Yeah,
right?
how much comes from appropriations, and how much is generated by the operations of the parks themselves?
I don't know the exact number, but I would say that it's upwards of 90% is through appropriation. So especially when you take in the fact that there's 300 units that have no collection of entrance fees, and that the bulk goes back into the fee collection programs. The argument around the fee increase, I've heard numbers of the proposed $70 fee increase in those 17 major parks over 6 months out of the year would generate about $70 million a year towards that backlog, is the number that's being tossed around. And realistically, that's sort of drop in the bucket figures as far as what it actually costs to manage public lands.
Is there any ever discussion of U.S. citizens having lower fees and higher priorities than people who are not U.S. citizens?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was traveling in Sri Lanka last year, and the entrance fees for locals in Sri Lanka who make on average $1 a day for them to visit their national parks was about 30 cents per person. And my entrance fee as a tourist traveling was $80. So definite disparity between what locals pay and what I paid as an international visitor. And I think to some extent the logic that follows here, right, is that those who pay taxes, right, so I pay money in taxes that then comes back to parks and forests and BLM as a federal appropriation. Therefore, should my entrance fee be less than others who pay entrances into the park internationally who don't pay taxes? I think the two arguments that I hear most frequently associated with this are that those international visitors are giving above and beyond through tourism dollars, right? So they're paying the bed tax. What's your bed tax in Carbondale? Do you know? Anyone know?
Somebody in this room that does. It's about 11% in Glenwood.
All right. So yeah, I hear 11 to probably 10 to 15% in most places is your kind of your bed tax. And so that money, the international visitors who are coming are more likely to be staying in hotels, eating in restaurants, like all of that revenue is generated. But yeah, so the argument that you primarily hear is that internationally they pay it through those taxes, but you're exactly right. Locals who are traveling would pay it as well. And then the other argument that accompanies that generally falls upon, pardon me, it falls upon that, equity clause, that if international visitors should have the same right and access to sort of natural wonders. There's a strong ethic within the National Park Service in particular that these aren't America's parks, that these belong to the world, that anyone should be able to come and visit and see these parks. And so the idea of charging a varied rate becomes exclusionary, and I think that rubs a lot of people wrong within the Park Service as well, just the same as to many of us, and I would probably put myself in this camp, charging anything above a minimal entrance fee rubs me wrong. I remember very distinctly when I would meet visitors who came through the entrance fee, or through the entrance booth, and were literally like pulling pennies out of the glove box in order to try to pay their entrance fee. And the meaning that meant to them to be able to be there, like I wanted to wave them through, right? I wanted to say, like, come on in, like, this is your park, we don't need your entrance fee, right? And so this question about use and who pays for the use becomes really interesting really quickly when you start to think about many layers, including international visitors who visit a lot of our parks.
We're gonna do one more question. So Michael's got it here.
Okay. So yeah, the increased fee seems like an unfair way to decide who gets limited out of experiencing parks. And you mentioned that some of your colleagues are talking about other ways, and there's lotteries and reservations. Are there different ways that you think are more fair, or just creative ways to limit use like that?
Yeah, I think fairness is a really great question, right? Like how do you measure access and making sure that everyone has fair access to a site? For me, and I'll tell you my biases going into it, is that I think that we need to accompany this conversation with a real consideration of carrying capacity, right? Like, what is the experience? I worked at Arches National Park in 2001 when we had 700,000 visitors per year, and I felt like it was crowded. I can go there now and there's 1.3 million visitors a year, and I feel like it's crowded, right? But there's still people coming in, and I was there 2 years ago and saw sunset at Delicate Arch with only 3 other people, which I didn't think was possible anymore, but I was there in like a Wednesday in January or something, right? So I think that this question of access needs to be accompanied by a question about what we could create an infrastructure to hold in our parks, right? And so does it change the experience? Certainly it does. But is it more fair to allow everyone to have the opportunity to see Delicate Arch, or to limit the opportunity to ensure that someone can get a solitary experience? And so as an educator, I come from an environmental education background. I believe there has to be a way to accompany this with good education that helps people understand how to behave in a public area in a way that it doesn't impact the experience of others, right? I'm not going to be annoyed if I'm at Delicate Arch and there are 5 people standing around beside me also quietly enjoying the sunset, but I might be annoyed if there are people, standing in front of the arch, burning incense and shouting, hollering, whatever it may be, that might impact my experience in that place. And so are there ways that we can educate people? Are there ways that we can help ensure that everyone can have a positive experience without limiting that access? I think that's a question to consider. A lot of it comes down to crazy drivers, right? We don't do shuttle systems when they're too expensive. Is that something we should subsidize? Is it worth the cost of paying more to make a shuttle possible in order to ensure that people can have a better experience rather than just limiting who can come in, right? So I think there's a money question at play here. And I think they all just need to be taken up together. I think early entry, when I was at Canyonlands, we talked about, could we do a graded fee structure where people who came in early got in cheaper than people who came in later? So you're still using the money, but you're not limiting who comes in, and maybe you get people into the park earlier in the day when it's generally less crowded. So thinking creatively about ideas like that. And I think that our superintendents and our park managers out there are doing that. I think that they really are, and they're holding public processes, and they're, you know, in Moab right now, they're having a public comment period on their traffic congestion plan right now, where they're listening to businesses, they're listening to locals. They want to hear that perfect solution that's out there so that they can come up with a new way forward. I think it's just a really hard one, and I think they haven't found it quite yet. And I think no one likes it coming from the federal level and being imposed on them. So, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your comments.